My son had always loved Saturday mornings at the baseball field. The smell of fresh-cut grass, the crack of the bat during warm-ups, the way he'd sprint out of the car before I even had the engine off. For 3 years, Riverside Youth League had been the best part of his week. Coach Mercer had been the best part of his season. That particular Saturday in October, the air was sharp and the bleachers were full. I was standing near the fence with my coffee, watching the boys run drills. My son, he was 10 years old, all elbows and nervous energy, was supposed to be out there with them. Instead, he was sitting alone at the far end of the bench. I almost didn't notice. There were other parents talking around me. Someone's little sister was crying about dropped popcorn, and the assistant coach was blowing his whistle every 30 seconds. But something made me look over at that bench again. My son had his elbows on his knees and his head down, and he was staring at the dirt like it owed him something. I set my coffee on the bleacher rail and walked over to the fence. "Hey," I called out, "you okay?" He looked up at me, just for a second, and then he looked away. That look, that 1 second, I've replayed it 1,000 times since. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't a bad mood. It was something else entirely, something careful and closed off that I had never seen on my son's face before, not once in 10 years. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he'd had a fight with one of the other kids. Maybe his stomach hurt. I told myself a lot of things that morning. The drive home was quiet. He sat in the back seat with his cleats still on, looking out the window. I asked him how practice went. He said fine. I asked if Coach Mercer had him working on his curveball. He said yeah. I asked if he wanted to stop for burgers. He said he wasn't hungry. My son is always hungry. I'm not sure I had ever once heard him turn down food after a practice. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You sure you're okay, buddy?" He didn't answer right away. He was picking at the strap of his gear bag. And then, very quietly, without looking up, he said, "Dad, can we just not talk right now?" I said, "Okay." I said, "Sure." I turned the radio on low and drove. But I kept watching him in that mirror. 2 weeks passed. He went to practice. He came home quiet. He picked at his dinner. He stopped talking about Coach Mercer the way he used to, that nonstop, breathless hero worship that used to make my wife laugh. Coach Mercer says if you follow through on your release, you get 10 more feet of distance. Coach Mercer played single-A ball for 2 seasons. Coach Mercer says mental toughness is 80% of the game. The silence where those sentences used to be was loud in a way I couldn't explain. My wife noticed too. She mentioned it one evening after he'd gone to bed, said he seemed withdrawn, said maybe he was having trouble with a kid at school, said kids his age go through phases. She wasn't wrong to think that. I had thought the same thing. But I kept coming back to that look on the bench, that 1 second look that was careful and closed off and not like my son at all. I didn't push him. Looking back, I wonder if I should have pushed earlier. But I know how boys that age can be. You push too hard, they shut the door completely. So I waited. I stayed close. I made sure he knew I was there. The night everything changed was a Thursday. I was in the garage after dinner, organizing equipment for an early morning job, when I heard the back door and then footsteps crossing the kitchen. A minute later, my son appeared in the garage doorway. He had his hands in his hoodie pocket and his shoulders were up near his ears. "Hey," I said. "What's up?" He stood there for a moment, just stood there, and I put down what I was holding and gave him my full attention, because something in his posture told me this was not a casual conversation. "Dad," he said, "I need to tell you something." The way he said it made the air go out of the room. I sat down on the workbench. "Okay," I said, "I'm listening." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I almost said something to fill the space, but I stopped myself. I just waited. "It's Coach Mercer," he finally said. And then it all came out. It had started about 6 weeks earlier, my son told me. Coach Mercer had begun pulling individual players aside during practice, calling them into the equipment storage room off the back of the dugout, one at a time, for what he called private performance reviews. Said he did it with every player. Said it was just between the coach and the player. Said what they talked about in there stayed in there. My son said the first time it happened to him, Coach Mercer had him sit down across from him and spent about 20 minutes talking about his mechanics, his grip, his stance, his throwing motion. Normal enough stuff, he said. Nothing that felt wrong exactly. Just a closed door and a rule about not talking about it. The second time, Mercer had put his arm around my son's shoulders and kept it there for most of the conversation. Told him he was special. Told him he had more potential than any kid on the team. Told him that the boys who made it to the next level were the ones who had a relationship with their coach: trust, closeness, loyalty. That word loyalty, my son repeated it carefully, like he'd been turning it over in his mind for weeks. The third time, Mercer had put his hand on the back of my son's neck. My son said it didn't hurt. He said nothing bad happened, the way he understood bad to mean. But he said it felt wrong. He said he'd wanted to move away and hadn't because he didn't want to be disrespectful. He said Mercer had told him this kind of close coaching relationship was what separated serious athletes from kids just playing a game. He said he hadn't told me because he thought I might pull him from the team. He said he hadn't told me because Mercer had specifically said the boys who blabbed to their parents weren't mature enough for this level of coaching. He said he hadn't told me because he was scared I wouldn't believe him. I believe you, I said. I said it immediately, and I said it clearly. I believe every word you just told me. My son looked at me. His jaw was tight and his eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. He was doing that thing boys do where they hold themselves very still so the feeling doesn't spill over. Okay, he said. Okay, I said. Here's what we're going to do. I did not call the league that night. I know that sounds wrong, but stay with me. My wife and I talked after my son went to bed. She was upset, the controlled, tight-faced kind of upset that in our house is much more dangerous than yelling. She wanted to call the league director immediately. She wanted to call the police. She wanted to drive to Mercer's house. I understood all of that. I felt all of that. But I'd seen enough situations like this, in my work and in my life, to know that a phone call made in anger at 10 o'clock at night, before we had anything documented, before we had any names, before we knew how wide this went, might do more harm than good. Mercer would deny it. The league would default to protecting itself. Our word against his, and without evidence, that was a fight we might lose. I told my wife, we're going to do this right. We're going to do this so that it sticks. She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded. The next morning, I took the day off work. I sat down with my son and asked him to walk me through every detail he could remember: dates, what was said, the exact words Mercer had used. I wrote it all down longhand. I asked him gently if he knew whether Mercer had done this with any other boys on the team. He thought for a moment and said yeah, he thought so. There was another kid, a boy named Tyler, who had stopped showing up to practices a few weeks ago. He'd told my son's teammate that he just didn't like baseball anymore. My son said that before Tyler stopped coming, he'd seemed different, quiet, like him. Tyler's family had pulled him from the league and I didn't have their number. But another parent, a guy named Paul, whose kid played second base, had mentioned Tyler's family at one of the games. I called Paul that afternoon. I kept it careful. I didn't tell him everything. I just said I was looking into something about the team and I'd appreciate a chance to talk privately. Paul said sure and came over that evening. I told him what my son had told me. Paul went very still. Then he told me that Tyler's mom, a woman named Renee, had mentioned something to him at the end of season party 2 years ago. She'd said Tyler had come home from a practice upset and that she'd asked the league about the one-on-one sessions in the equipment room and been told it was a standard part of Coach Mercer's program. She'd pushed a little, he said. Not hard enough to file a formal complaint, but she'd ask questions. And then Tyler had quit and the family had moved on. 2 years ago. I wrote that down. What I found over the next 4 days would have flattened me if I'd let it. I reached out carefully to 3 other families from the current team parents I trusted, parents whose kids seemed to have gone through the same quiet withdrawal my son had. 2 of them had noticed something. One of them, a father named Greg, had actually mentioned it to the league director 6 months earlier. Not a formal complaint, just a conversation, he said. He'd said that Mercer's individual sessions felt off to him and he wasn't sure about the closed-door policy. The league director had thanked him for his concern and told him Mercer had been coaching Riverside Youth League for 11 years without a single issue. Greg had let it drop. 11 years. I kept thinking about that number. I went back to Renee Tyler's mom and this time I was direct. I told her what my son had described. I told her about Greg's conversation with the league director. I told her we were documenting everything and that I intended to bring it to the police and the league board, formally and in writing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I should have pushed harder 2 years ago. I told her it wasn't her fault. And I meant it. She had asked questions and been told everything was fine. She'd trusted the institution. That's what you're supposed to do. But I was no longer trusting the institution. I filed a formal report with the police on a Tuesday morning. I brought every page of notes, the names of every parent who had agreed to speak on record, and a written statement from my son that we had worked on together with the help of a family attorney, a woman named Miss Calloway, who had been recommended by a parent in my son's school, and who told me within 10 minutes of reading our materials that this was serious and that I had done the documentation correctly. The officer who took my report, a detective named Franklin, listened to everything without interrupting. When I was done, he asked me several careful questions. At the end, he said, "I want you to know that you did the right thing coming in with documentation instead of just a verbal account. It makes a difference." I thanked him. Then I went to my car and sat there for a few minutes. I had a meeting the next morning with the Riverside Youth League Board of Directors. I had requested it in writing, certified mail, 2 days before. The meeting was held in the conference room of the League's administration building, which was just a converted double wide at the edge of the park property. 4 board members were present. The League director, a man named Walsh, sat at the head of the table with the careful expression of a person who has already decided how this meeting will go. He did not know what I had brought with me. I laid it out methodically. The documented accounts from my son, the statement from Tyler's family about the complaint 2 years earlier that had been verbally dismissed and never formally recorded, Greg's account of his conversation with Walsh 6 months ago, which Greg had now put in writing, the names of 4 current players whose parents had observed behavioral changes consistent with my son's timeline. Walsh started to speak twice. Both times I kept going. When I was finished, the room was quiet. One of the board members, a woman I didn't know, whose name tag said Karen Albright, picked up the folder I had placed in front of her and started reading. She read for about 2 minutes without saying anything. Then she looked at Walsh. "You received a verbal report about this 6 months ago?" Walsh said it hadn't risen to the level of a formal complaint. Karen Albright said, "It does now." Coach Mercer was suspended from all coaching activities pending investigation that afternoon. The investigation, which was conducted jointly by the League's oversight body and the local police department, took 11 weeks. I'm not going to walk through all of it because some of it is still part of an ongoing process and some of it isn't mine to tell. What I can tell you is that 4 families ultimately came forward. That Tyler's 2-year-old complaint was retrieved from a filing cabinet where it had been placed without any follow-up action ever being taken. That Greg's conversation with Walsh was verified. That Walsh resigned from the league directorship before the investigation concluded. And that Coach Mercer, 11 years, no issues on record, trusted by this community, was barred permanently from working with youth athletics organizations in our state. My son found out the night I came home from the final league board meeting. He was doing homework at the kitchen table. I sat down across from him and told him that it was done, and what done meant. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Are the other kids going to be okay?" That question. I had to take a breath before I answered. I told him I believed they would be. I told him that the reason I believed that was largely because of him, because he had been brave enough to walk into that garage on a Thursday night and say, "I need to tell you something." That because of that one moment, 4 families had documentation and support and the knowledge that they had been believed. That it is very hard to heal from something no one acknowledges happened. "I was scared you wouldn't believe me," he said. He'd said it before, but he said it again, and I think he needed to say it more than once. "I know," I said. "That's the part that keeps me up at night. Not what happened, because we handled what happened. What keeps me up is that you were scared to tell me. I need you to know that there is nothing you could tell me that would make me not believe you first. Okay? You come to me first, and we figure out whether it makes sense later. But I believe you first. Always." He nodded, went back to his homework. 15 minutes later, he asked if we could stop for burgers. I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in about 3 months. There's one more thing I want to say, and it's directed at every parent watching this. The people who hurt children are almost never strangers. They are almost always people who have built trust carefully, and over time coaches, teachers, leaders, mentors, people whose authority we have been taught to respect. And the tools they use are not dramatic. They are quiet. They are closed doors and special relationships, and the word loyalty used to mean don't tell. They rely on children being afraid that adults won't believe them. And they rely on adults being afraid to challenge someone with a good reputation, and 11 years on the record. My son walked into that garage because somewhere under all that fear, he trusted me. I do not take that lightly for a single day. If your child comes home quieter than they left, sit with that. If they stop talking about the person they used to talk about constantly, notice that. If they turn down food after practice, or stare at the dirt, or look at you for 1 second with an expression you've never seen before, believe what you're seeing. Ask. Wait. Listen. And then believe them. That's the only thing I did right in this whole story. Everything else, the documentation, the attorney, the board meeting, all of it came after. The first and most important thing I did was believe my son. Don't let the fear of being wrong stop you from being there when it counts. If this story meant something to you, please share it. There is a parent somewhere watching this who needs to hear it. And if you're a child watching this, or a young person who has been told to keep a secret from the people who love you that is not loyalty, that is a trap. Tell someone you trust. Tell them today. I'll see you next time.